Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. Today is the final episode of my Olympia Throwback series. We've gone through 6 episodes now, and how time flies. We are now within 2 weeks out of the 2024 Mr. Olympia, and we will be returning to some great comparisons of current athletes to see all those matchups before the time comes. But we have to knock this episode out first, so who do we have today? We've gone through 4 out of my predicted top 5. We've compared every single one of them except Derek Lunsford, so he's up. But I was kind of stumped on who to compare him to. I had a few options, so I asked you guys to decide for me. I gave you guys those options, but the overwhelming favorite was the early Phil Heath option. So Phil Heath will be Derek Lunsford's competition. For Derek's version, we're obviously using the 2023 Mr. Olympia package, but for Phil, I had a few options. I decided that anything pre-2010 was up for debate. 2011, he won his first Olympia, and really 2010, he probably should have also, and anything from 2010 on would have made this just too easy. Working backwards though, in 2009, he was sick at that Olympia, and I didn't want to handicap him any more than we already are, so I settled on 2008. But not the 2008 Mr. Olympia, the 2008 Ironman Pro version. This was his 3rd pro win, but he had yet to even go to the Olympia at this point, so I think this should be a very interesting matchup to say the least. Can the current Mr. Olympia fend off someone who has never even been to that contest yet, but someone who would end up being probably the 2nd best Mr. Olympia of all time? Let's find out. Here is Mr. Olympia Derek Lunsford versus 2008 Ironman Pro Phil Heath. If you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. We're starting out with the front double, an absolutely tremendous pose for both guys. Now, I want to preface something before we really start. I believe I have the reputation of being a Derek hater, and that I am. You guys have pegged me accurately, so I'm going to be very nice to Derek. I'm putting my rose-colored glasses on for brother Derek. He has bad lighting to work through, on top of Phil Heath having some of the literal best to ever be on a bodybuilding stage. The Ironman always knocked it out of the park. But also, I just want to make sure I'm giving Derek a fair shake. In fact, I was so nice to him that I think I made him a little taller than he should be. Sizing this one was a bit weird because Phil's photos were taken at a pretty steep angle looking up, but I gave Derek the benefit of the doubt every single time. So Derek probably is taller than he should be by just a little. It's all a part of me mending this relationship with brother Derek. But anyway, he's losing the first shot. I fail to see anything outside of shape that Derek does better in. Let's start in the quads. You have to go with Phil for the separation alone. Derek's quads are blurry, but Phil's quads also match his upper body better. It's not just about the quads, it's about how they fit the rest of the physique as well. Now going upstairs, let's just talk about the torso heap first. This is definitely the area that Derek does the best in. The vacuum in this shot doesn't bother me, it looks great, make no mistake about it, and his lat to waist ratio is insane. He's beating Phil in these aspects. Derek has the wider lats relative to his waist, and his waist is just smaller in general. Phil has good lats and his abs are good. This is not bubble gut Phil Heath, this is early Phil Heath. With a midsection that was pretty decent. He doesn't have the best taper, Derek beats him, but what more can you really ask for from Phil? He has good lats that taper nicely, the abs are nicely etched, and his waist isn't a problem. I think we could say that Phil isn't losing this area because he isn't doing anything wrong. Derek is just doing more right. He looks great, I'll give you that. But let's go to the arms now, and you know, I'm usually not the guy to weigh the arms too heavily, even in the front double biceps pose, but when the gap is this wide, it becomes really important. Phil's arms are like triple the size of Derek's, and Derek looks melted and smooth compared to how sharp and hard Phil's arms are. Overall, Phil is just more complete and has the better body parts, from arms to calves. Derek does do something right though, the shape aspect, and that is very important in this shot, but he is just getting chewed up and spit out here in most areas, I have to be honest. So in terms of the margin of victory on this one, again, I'm trying to be nice, but with decent shape and much better body parts, how could this be a close 1-point win? I won't make it 3 because Derek has that crazy X-frame, but Phil is outclassing him too much, so I'm settling on a solid 2-point win for Phil in the first shot. Now we have the front lat spread, one of the weaker poses for both guys. Phil just never had the structure for this one, but Derek has some issues too. Starting in the quads, once again you have to go with Phil, quite easily. It's really not even a competition yet again. Then in the midsection, they both have good ab definition here, but I actually like Derek more because there are just more abs there. But now in all the upper body peripherals, chest, delts, arms, forearms, you can even jump down to the calves because I forgot those. All of those things I just mentioned go to Phil easily. I will say though, I took photos from the finals for Derek's showing, and that definitely helped helped his notorious chest problem, which is the main critique I usually have in the shot. He still isn't very thick or hard or even separated, but he was definitely better here than he was at prejudging, so at least he does a little better in one of his weak links. But Phil trashed him here. He is so much thicker, so much rounder, and much more detailed. Same goes for the delts and arms. But what about the lats? Well, for one, Derek's lighting really doesn't give us the opportunity for a good look. It really is such a shame. Maybe that's who the real loser of this comparison is, the Olympia crew. They just don't care though. It's so obvious they don't give two about the fans, so let's just go back to the comparison. While we can't see much of Derek's lats, I think we get a good enough idea. They're decent, and he's wider in the clavicles compared to Phil, but surprisingly, a young Phil Heath does okay here. His lats taper pretty low, and they're pretty full. There's probably more surface area being taken up by his lats than Derek. And that's kind of a death sentence for Derek in this shot. I will say, and this is not me trying to be nice, this is a shot he could potentially take Phil in under the same lighting. I really think Phil is a little vulnerable here like he always was. But I gotta go with him based on what I see here for a small 1-point margin. Better legs, chest, delts, arms, and lats. Derek may have the better structure, but he's not capitalizing on that enough to pull it off. Now for our first side shot, this is actually closer than I thought it would be. In the side leg, I like Derek just a bit more, but they're really both winners yet again. Phil is bigger and has more glute striations, but Derek has those too and is even grainier than Phil everywhere else. Going up, Phil wins the midsection here, because he's the only one making an effort to keep it flexed, so this is kind of a default victory here. Then in the arm and delt, I was just floored by Phil. The separation between shoulder and arm and the roundness is just too much for Derek. But the interesting thing here is the chest. Derek has the full pecs and more width across the chest, which makes his pecs take up more space and he just has a neater shelf. But the softness from the last pose returns, and he really doesn't offer any detail here to speak of. Phil looks a bit narrow shoulder to shoulder for sure, but the quality on his pecs is just leagues above Derek's. And keep in mind, Phil is not looking at the camera, he's looking to the right hand side of the photo, meaning the camera is probably not capturing this pose 100% as Phil intends it. Basically, Phil is probably a little bit better in the chest if this photo was more head on. So we have to take that into account. Overall, I think this one is still fairly close though, because Phil is a bit more narrow up top and it hurts him in the pecs, but he's just so much bigger than Derek overall. And even though Derek had slightly better quality downstairs, that doesn't translate to the top floor. Phil has great cuts in the side leg, but he also schools Derek up top. Phil's conditioning is more even across the board. Derek has the more appealing pose perhaps, but to me the quality on Phil's upper body makes the difference. But I will keep it close here because I could definitely see the argument for Derek winning here, so let's just keep it at a 1-point victory for the gift. And now the pose you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, the rear double. These guys have backs that are both within the top 5 of all time at least. But Phil did earn that reputation a bit later into his career. His back was always stellar, but his back from 08 certainly wasn't as good as 2011, 2013, or heck, even a year like 2018. He just got harder, drier, etched more detail as he went on into his career. So while it was always good, in 2008 he hasn't quite unlocked all of those qualities that he would later have. But is this enough to beat Derek? Let's eat our vegetables first and talk about the limbs to start. Derek has the sharper glutes, but again, this is not because Phil is bad. Phil has 10 out of 10 glutes, you can't ask for much more. Derek just takes it to 11. However, I don't like the very obvious horns Derek is growing at the top of his glutes. This is something that hurts him, make no mistake about it. It even hurts me to look at. Now on the hamstrings, I do have Phil. They're just a bit thicker and more separated. And finally in the quad sweeps, I actually have Derek. Phil is posing a bit too narrow and Derek is riding the horse, and that brings out more sweeps and details in those sweeps. But let's jump to the upper limbs now. Derek is bigger in the delts, but Phil is much more separated inside the delts and between the delts and the arms. And he maintains the good advantage in the arms, so he's taking the entire upper limb. But finally, what about the back? Well, just in terms of overall size of the back and width, I have to go with Derek. Even on a smaller frame, his back is bigger. Derek also takes the lower back. Phil is a bit too green here. Derek has more going on and more detail. He has a true Christmas tree. Derek is also a little more detailed throughout the upper back, as he is a bit drier. But Phil has the advantage on the opposite end of the spectrum. Sure, he isn't super hard or dry, but the detail just pops. He has that signature 3D effect even in the back. So this is close, and I really am curious as to who you guys have winning here, so let me know down in the comments. I'm not afraid to say it though. I have Derek winning. It's just a single point win, mind you, and I could go back and forth, and even if I was going with Phil, I wouldn't make this anything more than a 1-point win. Derek's back is just bigger, he's wider, and he has a bit more detail from lower to upper back. Now maybe I am being a little nice, but let me just just say this is a very fresh Phil Heath, a very green Phil Heath. This is 3 years from his first Olympia, and if we put something like 2013 up here, we would definitely have a different story. But I think Derek just might be able to take Phil on this one. He at least gets pretty close to this version, and I'd say that's a win even if he doesn't win the pose. But again, to me, he does. If you want the better limbs but a slightly less drier back, you can go with Phil. But I'm going for the more detailed back. Again, let me know down in the comments who you have winning. This next back pose is a little more clear than the last one. Phil beats Derek in the lower body here. I'm a little more comfortable saying it outright in this pose. The hams look even better and the glutes even sharper, but Derek is still not that far behind at all. But in terms of width in the back, the most important factor, Derek has it over Phil. Phil's posing isn't the best here, and he needs that to do well here because he has a narrow structure to begin with. At this point in his career, he needed more polish as well. He needed that grainy factor and that dryness, and he would certainly gain that rather quickly throughout his career. But here, his back isn't the hardest. Derek is more separated actually and drier, and Phil's posing leaves some to be desired and it hurts him. He still has a nice 3D quality to his lats and traps, so his back is very solid. But with Derek being solid in the lower body, more separated up top and wider, Phil can't win this one. Making this worth anything more than 1 point, however, just doesn't feel right. So even though it's a clearer pose than the last one, I'm sticking to a 1 point margin for Derek just because Phil is still so good, just not good enough in the right things. Now let's go back to the side for our last side pose, the side tricep. I almost had Derek winning the last one. It was close. But here he just has too many issues. His side leg is probably a few percent better than Phil's yet again. It's the same thing I said in the side chest. Phil has great detail and more size, but Derek has even more detail and I really like that. But that's where the winning stops because the upper body quality falls off a cliff for our brother Derek. The midsection is doughy, the pecs soggy. Phil has round pecs, pecs that don't sag, and his midsection is more detailed for sure. Again, he's not soggy and saggy in the lower stomach region. And any pose that is placing emphasis on the arm is a pose that Phil is going to do well in. His tricep is twice the thickness of Derek's, and Phil's even sports some neat feathering, and he has striations in the delt as well. This is much clearer than the side chest was, but I had to remind myself to play nice. Derek brings a mean side leg. One of the better ones I've ever seen, to be frank with you, but the upper body quality doesn't match. So I'll make this a 2 point win, but Derek is very, very lucky this isn't 3. He's lucky I'm being nice here. But speaking of 3 point wins, we've reached the abs and thighs. I never thought I'd see the day that Phil sweeps this pose, but today is the day. Derek forfeits the shot basically. And no, I am not giving him a reprieve for the vacuum. I actually would have if only he had made an effort in the actual crunched ab shot, but he really didn't. He hit it for approximately 1 second, and that is just not enough. Not to mention, this is one of the worst poses I've ever seen from a Mr. Olympia. So even in that 1 second that Derek did hit this, his flexed abs and thighs is atrocious. The softness to the obliques is uncharacteristically soft. Even based on what we've seen so far, the abs are odd looking to say the least, and the quads really aren't that good either. And that really just disqualifies him from this shot. Not only because it's so bad, but because he didn't even really hit the shot. We're lucky to even have this photo. And Phil looks really good here. He wins the quads even over Derek's vacuum shot where they look a bit better. But with this early version of Phil, he doesn't let the stomach consume the conversation. He lets his abs do the talking and they have plenty to say. Sure, the taper isn't the best, but it's something, and the abs themselves are very blocky and very separated. So we have our first and maybe only 3 point win in this comparison. And surprisingly, it came from the abs and thighs. And it was for Phil Heath of all people. Who would have thought? And finally, we have our last pose. Maybe it's a bit anticlimactic though. You may recall that Phil had one of the best, most musculars of all time. And Derek, as of right now, has one of the weaker ones, even in the current crop of his fellow competitors. He certainly has one of the weaker ones among modern Olympia champions. Let's just first compare the two hands clasp variations we see here. Starting from the bottom, Derek's legs look pretty good. They're the best they've looked throughout this comparison, in fact. He looks wider than Phil here, but I would say Phil's detail top to bottom is pretty deep and he's drier. But let's play nice. We're in the home stretch. Let's give Derek a slight nod in the lower body for this pose. Moving up, does he also win the midsection? No. Phil's abs don't look as good as they did in the last shot, but Derek's are way too shallow. But does Derek win the chest? Also, no. He's too soft. Phil is bringing that 3D roundness and superb detail. Now, Derek seemingly has a size advantage in the delts. Phil apparently needed a little bit more time to build the delts up to what we would know them for. But on a real stage, I'd probably give them to Phil. He's just more separated in those delts, and the arms are just way too freaky. Derek's arms look pretty good here, but on the same stage, again, I think the difference would be incredibly apparent. So between these two variations, Derek looks pretty big. big. He's wider than Phil. And remember, we said that we would give him the legs for now, so he wins that. But the roundness and detail would still be too much for Derek. But if that wasn't convincing enough, just take a gander at Phil's crab shot. This is just for sport at this point. There is more quality and roundness in this shot in Phil's chest, delts, and arms region than Derek has in his entire front side, let's be real. And add some monstrous traps in there and solid legs as well. Derek is lucky he just had a below average showing against Phil's other variation, because if it was anything less than that, I would give this entire shot to Phil by 3 points. And it really probably should be when you average everything together. On a real stage, Derek is just barely going to be wider, but in the crab that won't matter because Phil's delts make him look just absolutely so wide. But Derek is pretty big and his legs look good here. I must show some restraint. In my book, this is a 4-point win to tell you the truth, but we're judging best out of 3 points, and Derek has elements that are good, like 2 elements, but that's still something. I'll cut Phil's margin by 1 point down to 2 points, but it pains me to do so. I hope all you Derek lovers appreciate what I've done for you and him throughout the mandatories. I've been very nice to brother Derek, but it's time to move on. But I guess I have to try and be nice just a little bit longer because now we have the overall physique categories round of judging. I'll try to keep up this facade as we go through the 4 categories and examine the whole physique. We're taking a look at overall shape, muscularity, conditioning, and flaws. And there technically is a bonus category for this episode. But really, let's just go through these quick. If it wasn't obvious from all these poses, Phil is by far the more well-rounded individual. And that's just tough for Derek. First off, I have Phil taking the conditioning and muscularity categories by 2 points each. The conditioning one I'm firm on. The only reason it's not 3 is because Derek had great conditioning from the back and in the side leg. But Phil did too, and Phil took him to school in the front, so this category is pretty much set. But for muscularity, I could, I guess, make it a 1-point win, but Derek is just too small, and Phil is incredibly complete, maybe the most complete bodybuilder of all time, even back then. Phil is also going to win the flaws category. Name a flaw. There really is only one. He's a bit narrow, and okay, I'll bite, but Derek had horns growing out of his glutes, some questionable lats, doughy chest, and he refused to hit a pose. That literally pisses me off to no end. I have to double down here. Let's just say Derek is more flawed than Phil. Let's not beat a dead horse, so we'll include a small 1-point win here for Phil. But in the last regular category, Derek will get a small win because it's shape. His X-frame is better. His waist was smaller. Phil wasn't bad though. Far from it at this point in his career. Go back and look at the front double and front lat. Phil had decent aesthetics for how muscular he is. Derek is really only aesthetic with the vacuum too, keep in mind. If you made him crunch down on his abs in the front double and the actual ab shot in the front relaxed, it would be a completely different story. But hey, it's the only thing Derek really wins over Phil, so for the last time, thank goodness, I'll be a little nice and just make it a 2-point win. But that means it's time for the last category, the bonus category, the fans vote. I put out polls before all of these episodes, and depending on the margin, the winner of the poll got 1 to 3 points. Usually I repeat what the winner needs to meet, vote percentage wise, in order to get 1, 2, or 3 points, but this one is so overwhelming, I don't think I have to spell it out for you. At some points during this poll, as I was watching the results come in, I thought Derek would fall below double digits, but he held on to that at least. But yeah, when you're barely hanging on to double digits, it's clearly going to be another 3-point win here for Phil. And I have to be honest, this did have a little to do with me being nice. So maybe you didn't like the nice guy act, but I knew you guys would be absolutely ruthless when it came to voting, and you didn't disappoint. I just wanted to balance you guys out a little bit. So I guess Derek does still get a very small reprieve with me being head judge. What we just witnessed, if I'm not mistaken, was the most dominant victory in Project Bodybuilding history, with a commanding 60+ point lead. With 83.1 points, winning this comparison was 2008 Phil Heath. Derek was only able to muster up 16.9 points. And guys, remember, I tried my very best to be nice to Derek. And I do feel that this is basically his best case scenario. Maybe his best case scenario is just a little better. Just looking at some of the margins and the poses, the only thing I would change for Derek and this absolutely best case scenario would be giving him the front lat. I'm not changing anything else. How could I? Even in the overall physique categories, sure, he got bogged down because of that 3-point loss because you guys in the bonus category, so I guess we could take that out. But even if you did all of that, Derek's literal best case scenario still has him losing by 50 points. Phil would get 75.1 points to Derek's 24.9. And again, that's switching a pose and eliminating a category altogether. And even with that score, I still think this may be the most resounding victory I've had with my scoring system. And if that's Derek's best case scenario, what is his worst? In that case, it would probably be him losing all but the rear lat spread. I could still have him losing the front lat in this scenario and Phil picking up the rear double. Both very realistic things. Then in the overall overall physique categories, I could have Phil winning muscularity by 3, and maybe Derek only wins shape by 1 point instead of 2. But I'm not going to calculate that, I think you get the point. The moral of the story here is that I was very favorable to Derek from sizing to scoring, and Phil Heath, 2008 Phil Heath, who had never stepped on the Olympia stage before, beat Derek easily. Now, I get it, it's Phil Heath, and he's probably the second best bodybuilder of all time next to Ronnie Coleman, solely in terms of the bodybuilding aspects, not legacy or anything like that. But this was 3 to 5 years before Phil even hit his prime, and Derek could only win 2 shots, both with just a point each. Look, I know I'm a Derek hater, but this says something. I'm not going to spell it out either because I think you get the drift. A rookie Phil Heath is beating the current Mr. Olympia soundly. Phil had great size and a lot of roundness, making him look even more impressive, and he was very complete too. And when his stomach was in, even his worst shots weren't that bad. His worst shots were the front lat spread and the abs and thighs, and he won both, getting a perfect score in one of them. Derek has good wow factor in a couple of shots, but Phil has even more of that wow factor and exposed him everywhere else. But it wasn't just about muscle. The biggest difference, even bigger than the completeness aspect to me, was the quality aspect. Top to bottom, front to back, Phil had Derek's number in overall conditioning and muscle quality. Derek was okay in some areas, but in others he just fell off and literally looked soggy and saggy. Phil's detail between muscle groups and inside muscle groups was top notch, even in 2008. Imagine this comparison had the 2013 version, where he had more maturity under his belt and an even better back. Derek may honestly lose every single shot, because even this version opened up the largest gap I've ever seen in my comparisons. Phil was just a total package, even back in 2008. It's not just that Derek was bad, Phil is just nuts, even looking at his early years. But let me repeat what I said earlier and you can unpack it more yourself. 2008 Phil, a Phil 3 to 5 years before his prime, easily dispatched our current 2023 Mr. Olympia. Make of that what you will. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. I don't think many of us are going to disagree on this one, but if you do, if you legitimately think Derek won this, please, I am begging you, comment and tell us all why. We'll all be waiting. And for those that had Phil winning, what poses would you give him? Would you give him 5 poses, 6 poses, all of them? Let me know how many and which ones down below. And if you guys have enjoyed this series, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. This series may be done, but you're going to want to stick around for all my future videos and projects on this channel. Again, we're just 2 weeks out from the 2024 Mr. Olympia, less than that even, so we actually have some more matchups to judge before we get there. And all Olympia long, I'll be streaming and bringing you some of the best coverage possible. And I know I said we're done with the series, but technically we do have one more episode. Me, Desktop Bodybuilding, Bodybuilding News Network, EP09 Bodybuilding, and Mark's Max Muscle will be doing a live comparison on my channel September 29th, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Chances are you are viewing this video on that day, so make sure you're around at 7 p.m. so you don't miss that live comparison and my very special guests. By the way, if you guys want to support the channel and are in need of some high quality supplements, consider visiting Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, be sure to use my code Project10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code Project10 at armsracenutrition.com. And finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this series, and I will see you all in the next video.
Get Alexia.